Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you
Hi there, and welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. My name is Jeff Gomez, and in this episode I'll be looking at GBV's second record, 1987's Sandbox. But first, let me say that all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices unless otherwise stated. Also, any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators. Special thanks goes out to Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database, which you can find at gbvdb.com, and of course, all opinions stated are my own. You can subscribe to future episodes or listen to past episodes at everygbvlp.com, and finally, if you'd like to drop me a line, you can do so by sending an email to jeff@everygbvlp.com. Now let's get to the show. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Sandbox, the second record that GBV self-released in the 80s. So I have to admit, I hadn't really listened to this in a long time, probably not since I first got the Scat box set back in 1995. With a group like GBV, the same as with any group or artist who has a big catalog, you tend to go for your favorites, and for me, these early records probably get the least amount of listening time, even though they're really important in terms of the history of Guided by Voices. And with 24 records to choose from, I rarely, if ever, choose anything pre-Propeller. That being said, I was pleasantly surprised listening to this again. And even though GBV is a band who wouldn't find their classic sound for a few albums, the early stuff isn't horrible or cringeworthy. Like, as much as I love David Bowie, I never reach for that very first record of his where he's trying to be Anthony Newley. And while I like New Order, I think I've listened to their first record all the way through maybe once. They really didn't hit their stride until their second and third records, so those are the ones I tend to listen to. And while that's also kind of the case with GBV, when it comes to Sandbox, it's really not as bad as you probably remember, and it's certainly not bad as people say it is. For example, Stereogum listed Sandbox as the worst GBV record in a 2013 look, and Pollard himself has said that it's his least favorite GBV record. And while it's hard to argue with either of those, again, with so many records, something has to come in last place. There are some interesting things about Sandbox, as well as some important things to look at in terms of GBV history. First and foremost, the fact that it was the second GBV in a year shows that Pollard had gotten the bug to record and make records. It was something he was determined to do, despite the fact that no one had positively reacted to either their last LP or their EP. But Pollard didn't care. He was now on a quest to capture what he heard in his head. And if Sandbox sort of sucks, that's okay because Pollard didn't stop with this record. In fact, Sandbox spurred him to try harder and push himself, which led to the later records we all know and love. In terms of Sandbox as the title to the record, I'm not sure if Bob just liked the word or whether it's a direct reference to anything. Like, is the record a sandbox for his ideas? Or was the recording studio becoming his sandbox, a place where he loved to play? I'm not sure. And in terms of it being a name for other people's records, a guy named Eric Vokes put out a record called Sandbox in 1993 on the Rockville label. Rockville sounds a lot like Rockathon, but that's probably just a coincidence. Most recently, Sandbox was used as the title for a 2004 compilation of music by the Lake Mark Sandman from Morphine. Sandman actually died on stage, suffering a massive heart attack in 1999 while in Italy performing with Morphine. There was also a Canadian alternative band named Sandbox in the 90s, and there was a song named Sandbox that appeared on the 1969 album Warm from Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. Finally, according to a 2017 story on the CBS News website, playground sandboxes can be, quote, breeding grounds for bacteria, parasites, and other infectious germs, whether brought in by animals using them as litter boxes or by kids interacting with other kids, unquote. Just something to keep in mind the next time you head to the park. There's no definite release date for the record, but the same as everything leading up to the Scat releases in 1993, what did release even mean? The record got a couple of reviews when it came out, so maybe the band sent out some promo copies. But I don't get a sense from anything that I've read that this or any of the other early records traveled any farther than Dayton and friends of the band. Unlike the debut LP Devil Between My Toes, Sandbox was released on Halo Records. I'm not sure what happened to Schwa Records. Maybe Bob just felt like making a change. We know from the Suitcase series that Bob always has on hand hundreds of band names, and that when he was growing up he made imaginary records with imaginary bands and fake covers and labels, so maybe Halo was just part of that. He'd go on to have half a dozen label names in the future, Happy Jack Records, Fading Captain, and so on. So in terms of Halo, I think he was probably just bored of Schwa and wanted something new. 1,000 copies were produced, and it was issued originally just on black vinyl. The cover is a band photo taken by Bruce Greenwald. Bruce is later listed as crew for the Get Out of My Stations EP, and he also gets thanked on B1000 and the Forever Since Breakfast EP. The photo of the band, which Bob later called a corny fucking photo, shows Bob, his brother Jim, and Mitch and Kevin lounging on a lawn. There is some stuff in the background, like a statue and a windmill. I'm not sure if this is Pollard's house or a botanical garden or what. Kevin looks the coolest, leaning back and resting on his elbows and with bare feet. Pollard's looking at the camera kind of skeptically. He might be holding a bottle of wine, or maybe it's a big bottle of beer. Whatever it is, it's certainly not a can of Miller Lite, the drink that later became associated with the band. Mitch looks very 80s in a yellow polo shirt. His hair is also kind of short, and he looks, dare I say, sort of preppy. Jim, wearing a striped t-shirt, is barely in the photo. In addition to the name of the band and the record, the cover also says stereo, the way a lot of records from the 60s did, back when stereo was kind of a new thing. In fact, the first 5 Beatles records, everything up until Rubber Soul, had the word stereo on the front cover. The front also has a drawing of a nymph, which was done by Mark Greenwald, who is presumably Bruce's brother. He's also the same guy who did the drawing of the sun on Forever Since Breakfast. The back cover features 4 more photos of the guys. These were probably taken the same day as the cover photo, since they're all wearing the same clothes, and Kevin's still not wearing shoes. These are indoor shots, and in one of them, Bob's sitting on a small plastic chair and offering to the camera either a tomato or a pepper or an apple, I can't really tell. The photos aren't too bad, and the song titles in a really big font look kind of cool. As a package, it definitely looks more like a professional record than Devil Between My Toes. The back cover also has the Halo logo and a weird production credit that I'll talk about in a minute. Unlike their previous LP, which had the Buckeye and Briar sides, Sandbox is just made up of an A side and a B side. The Halo logo is the word in a kind of italic script with what looks like a hand-drawn halo with some light emanating from it. A halo is of course defined as a disk or circle of light shown surrounding or above the head of a saint or holy person to represent their holiness. I'm not sure if this is a tongue-in-cheek reference to religion or whether Pollard's sincere in his belief of halos and angels. He's never shown himself to be overtly religious, although where he comes from, the Midwest, is known to be religious. In the recent song Warm Up to Religion on 2017's August by Cake, Pollard talks about witnessing some sort of holy roller church with people in religious ecstasy, asking, "Why are they screaming? What did they win?" Later in the song he says, "Here's to them building a house, maybe I'm in." So maybe Pollard's considering religion more as he gets older, the same way his grandmother did in the song Old Battery from Devil Between My Toes. But at this stage of his life, when he was just 30, I don't see any real signs of religiosity. In terms of who plays on the record, the biggest change is that Tobin Sprout had nothing to do with it. He's thanked but doesn't play in anything. Also gone from the last record is drummer Peyton Eric. Instead, Kevin Fennell drums on all the songs, and Mitch is still on bass. Bob again handles almost all the guitar, and brother Jim plays on a lot of the songs too. Producer Steve Wilbur also plays lead guitar on a few songs, expanding his role from the previous record. Otherwise, this is just about as small as Guided by Voices would ever get. It's essentially a power trio with Bob on guitar and vocals, Mitch on bass, and Kevin on drums. And it's funny because you never think of them as a trio, or at least I never do. Guided by Voices, at least when performing, has pretty much always consisted of 5 guys. However, when it came to recording, that could mean just about anything. Basically, it was whoever was around. During the recording of Sandbox, Pollard started hanging around with Greg Demos. He's the bass player who, along with Tobin Sprout, Mitch Mitchell, and Kevin Fennell, would later go on to form the so-called classic lineup. At the time, Demos was playing guitar in a band called The New Creatures. The New Creatures were formed in 1981 by Demos and Bill Hustad. Don Thrasher was on drums, and, showing how small the scene was in Dayton, he later started to play with Guided by Voices around 1990, appearing on some of their most important records. Bob had met Demos at a New Creatures show in 1986, and by 1987, the New Creatures were also recording at Steve Wilbur's studio, while GBV were making Sandbox. The record that Demos' band was making was called Rafter Tag. It came out on the charmingly named Scumfish Records. You can get it for about $10 on Discogs. Rafter Tag seems to refer to a game that's like tag, but you play it in a barn and you can't touch the ground. The New Creatures released 3 full-lengths and a 7-inch before breaking up in 1988. Years later, a goth band in New York would take on the name The New Creatures. The New Creatures are thanked on the record sleeve for Sandbox, along with a whole bunch of other people, including Bob's wife and kids. Pete Jamison's listed again as the manager. On Devil Between My Toes, he was just thanked, but on Forever Since Breakfast, he was listed as the manager. That being said, he didn't manage much on a day-to-day basis since the band wasn't playing out live, and Bob wouldn't really let anyone do anything promotional for the early records since he wasn't too proud of them. Still, Jamison was hugely important in the story of Guided by Voices. Pollard has even admitted this, saying that without Jamison, there is no GBV, and that goes for Sandbox too. That's because, to pay for Sandbox, Bob, Jimmy, and Pete took out a loan from the Teachers Credit Union. At first, they were turned down, and you can kind of guess why, right? Imagine if you had 3 guys in your office and they want money to make a record. They don't play shows and they don't have fans. There's no steady lineup and they're recording it in some guy's garage. Plus, their other records weren't actually on sale anywhere. But then Pete remembered that his mom's signature was on file at the bank because of her mortgage. So he asked, what if my mom's name was on the loan? And the manager, who was also in bands, took pity on them and gave them the loan. That loan not only paid for Sandbox, but would be renewed and repaid over and over again, paying for pretty much the rest of the self-released recordings. An interesting thing about Sandbox is that, on the sleeve, the record is credited as a production of Gotham City Music, and there was an insert to the LP that said at the top, Gotham City Music Presents, and below this there were photos and descriptions of all the GBV and GBV-related releases up to that point. That means both GBV LPs, the EP, but also the LP and single by Greg Demos' band, The New Creatures, as well as Tobin Sprout's Figure 4 releases. In terms of Gotham City Music being any sort of entity, I think it's just a meaningless thing, like Halo or Schwa Records. It's something Pollard made up in order to make people believe that GBV was a real band. But I also wonder if, in the absence of any sort of Dayton scene, or any sort of scene anywhere that Pollard belonged to, that he was trying to create one from scratch. Maybe he knew about guys like Tony Wilson creating Factory in Manchester, and he wanted to do something similar. I don't know if Pollard ever tried to put on shows or anything. Lord knows GBV didn't play out. So maybe it was less of that and more just trying to convince critics or writers to review GBV and take them seriously. And since Sandbox is the only LP of the 5 self-released records to get any kind of contemporary reviews, it looks like it worked in terms of getting them a bit of press. Another thing about the Gotham City insert is that it includes a Pollard release that never came out. It was going to be a 6-song EP called The Everlasting Big Kick, but it never materialized. What's interesting is that it was going to be credited to just Robert Pollard and not Guided by Voices. This is just about 10 years before his actual solo debut LP, Not in My Air Force. This shows he was already thinking about releasing stuff under his own name even that far back. Among the 6 songs that were going to be included on the Everlasting Big Kick EP were Stumbling Blocks to Stepping Stones, Once in a While, and Bird. Once in a While can be found on the first Suitcase compilation, officially known as Suitcase, Failed Experience in Trashed Aircraft, but the others aren't widely available. And again, just to show how interconnected the Pollard verse is, the phrase Everlasting Big Kick crops up later in the song The Enemy from 2001's Isolation Drills. Everlasting Big Kick is also the name of a Guided by Voices cover band operating out of New York City. Sandbox was again recorded at the garage studio of Steve Wilbur, which is where they recorded debut LP Devil Between My Toes. But unlike last time, where it said produced by Bob, with Bob all in caps, this record was produced by GBV and Steve Wilbur. Pollard liked Wilbur's studio because it was cheap and it was right around the corner from where Pollard was living. Pollard now calls Sandbox overproduced, but it doesn't sound that way to me. It's certainly not slick or commercial. Maybe Pollard just means it's not spontaneous. He likes to move fast, and maybe Wilbur, as a co-producer, was more of a stickler for precise takes, and maybe that chafed against Pollard's desire to just record something and move on. At 12 songs and only 27 minutes and 7 seconds, it's the shortest GBV LP as well as the one with the fewest songs. 5 songs are under 2 minutes and only 2 are longer than 3 minutes. The first song, Lips of Steel, starts with a guitar riff that sounds sort of like the Kings, almost like You Really Got Me. The bass, though, is kind of cheesy, but the drums are more rock and roll. There are lots of fills and a 4/4 beat. Gone are the post-punk experiments of Devil Between My Toes. The song seems to be partially about a band saying, "Let's go see the show," and ending with an announcement for a band, with Pollard saying in a sort of radio DJ voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, backed by popular demand for your entertainment and spiritual enlightenment, Electric Jam Soul Aquarium." That certainly sounds like a Pollard band name, if not a song. Also, the line, "We're on our way," looks forward to the "We're finally here" line from Echo Smyron from B1000. It's a short song that goes right into the next one, A Visit to the Creep Doctor. Now, not only is the English accent not here, but on this song he sounds really Southern. He practically has a drawl. It's a fast song and not a bad one. There's a little electronic noise in the background that's kind of interesting. The sound is almost cowpunk, which is described on Wikipedia as combining punk rock or new wave with country, folk, and blues in sound, subject matter, attitude, and style. Some prominent cowpunk bands were The Blasters, Jason and the Scorchers, and Super Suckers. In terms of the lyrics, I have no idea what the song is about. The next song is Every Day. The opening sounds just like the 1985 song Love Vigilantes by New Order. I'm not sure if Bob ever heard it. I don't quite peg him as a New Order fan, but he may have followed them since he likes post-punk and Wire, so it stands to reason he liked or at least knew about Joy Division. The guitars on this song, especially on the verses, are very REM. This is also a really interesting song lyrically. The straightforward nature of the subject matter and the way Pollard presents ordinary life stands apart from almost everything he ever wrote. Bob's now known for crazy flights of lyrical fancy or being really surreal, like I met a non-dairy creamer explicitly laid out like a fruitcake. But on this song, he's talking about the everyday aspects of life, stuff we deal with and face, well, every day. And I'm going to have to differ here with the lyrics I found online for this song. To me, Pollard's saying, clouds of industrial waste rise up to obscure God's very blue sky. But online you're going to find clouds open dust and waves rise up to obscure God's very blue sky. That doesn't sound right to me, not to mention it makes no sense. Again, not that a lot of Pollard's songs necessarily make sense. So I'm going to go with my ears and stick with clouds of industrial waste. Plus, that line tracks with a sentiment for the rest of the song. Now, the use of God there, in terms of God making or owning the sky, is really odd to me. I don't know if this is a genuine reference or that Pollard actually believes in God, let alone that God's the one who made the sky blue, or whether Pollard's writing in character is just being colloquial or what. A few lines later he says, lines of shopping mothers grabbing their kids, pushing up to the front, rows of pretty little houses and lawns, I want you to have a beautiful one. 10 years later, on OK Computer, Radiohead would talk about such a pretty house and such a pretty garden. To me, that song's about the deal you make with a system to get what you want, a handshake of carbon monoxide. Pollard's talking about the same thing here, too, how you can have a nice house and a nice car, but it comes at a price. Whether you're paying for it directly, like when Pollard writes about money burning through the exhaust pipe, or in a larger sense by having to live with industrial waste that blots out the blue sky. It's about the price we all pay just to get by and live our lives, and all the concessions we make along the way. The next song, Barricade, is the longest song on the record by a long shot at 4.5 minutes.
6 guns alone, an emotional avalanche.
It's a really interesting song made up of a bunch of different parts. Pollard's showing his prog side here, and that's something that would crop up throughout GB's career, whether it was in songs like Over the Neptune, Mish Gear Fox, or just chopping up songs and squashing them together like Back to Saturn X Radio Report from Propeller. The lines in the middle section, Little child, won't you dance with me, are a direct lift, you can't even call it a reference, to the Beatles song Little Child from 1963, which starts with those exact lines. That song appeared on their second record, With the Beatles. Pollard's talked a lot about loving the Beatles. In fact, in the list of his top 10 records of all time, which he compiled for Jane magazine, he listed 2 Beatles records, the White Album and Abbey Road. And he's even said how his first big pop culture experience was watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. It's definitely an influence you can hear later in GBV, in both the short, poppy songs and the way he sings with an English accent. In fact, he's almost getting to the accent on some of this song. The song has a guitar solo from Steve Wilbur, and it's not bad. It adds nice color to the song as it fades out. The last song on the first side is Get to Know the Ropes.
I'm positive, boy, that you're not the one.
This song has a callback to the MC or whatever from the second song, announcing the fictitious band, Electric Jam Soul Aquarium. Speaking again about the Beatles, that sort of harkens back to Sgt. Pepper's, where the fictitious band is introduced in the first song and then given a reprise at the end of the record. Side 2 starts off with Can't Stop. This is a typical rocker of the period where Pollard again has a decently pronounced southern accent. Third song, Trap Soul Door, is a short song that, lyrically anyways, reminds me of Game of Pricks.
So right and I'm so wrong, but we could be lonely before too long. And I don't care if the whole thing's going wrong, 'cause we will be lonely before too long.
In Game of Pricks, Pollard says, I never asked for the truth, but you owe that to me. And in this song he says, I'm still wrong, but you're still a liar. Pollard has said that the song's about not being able to get along in a relationship, admitting that he has a pretty bad temper, but that since he gave up sports, he's better at controlling it. Long Distance Man is another nod to the Beatles.
And he keeps on going 'cause it's not worth blowing. And he does what he can 'cause it's not worth losing. And there ain't no choosing.
It's a soft acoustic song with layered harmonies that sounds like some of the acoustic Beatles songs of '65, like You're Gonna Lose That Girl. And in the title, not to mention the sound, it's a nod to Nowhere Man. 2 contemporary reviews of Sandbox appeared after it was first released. One is written by a friend of theirs, which the guy admits in the opening line. He goes on to say that Pollard is definitely a force to be reckoned with and that his pop sensibilities are sharp and he's no slouch with the hooks. I'm not sure where this review appeared. It was probably in a local magazine since the reviewer knows Pollard personally. More impressive is a mention that appeared in Spin magazine. It was in the January 1989 issue and was part of a column named Underground, which was a monthly look at underground bands all across the country. The column was written by Byron Coley, who normally wrote for the zine Forced Exposure. Forced Exposure was started in Boston by Jimmy Johnson and, at first, focused just on the hardcore scene. The zine's now long gone, but Forced Exposure lives on as a mail-order website, which you can find at forcedexposure.com. The site sells all kinds of really good music, so check it out. The Spin magazine column that Guided by Voices was mentioned in also included some bands that later turned out to be pretty important to the indie scene, such as Beat Happening, Galaxy 500, and The Screaming Trees. And of the 10 bands, GBV is listed first at the top of the page, and they're also featured first in the column. Coley describes GBV as one of the sharpest sounding ankle pop bands out of the Midwest. He also writes that GBV plays the hardball pop game like a field of kangaroos, hopping from stroke to riff. He finally refers to them as Beatles-esque, which I agree with and definitely hear on Sandbox. At the time, Spin was a pretty big magazine with a circulation of a couple 100,000. U2 was on the cover of the issue GBV was featured in. And while it wasn't as big as Rolling Stone, Spin was seen as a lot more hip. It would be the biggest and best press mention they'd get until they started getting reviews for their scat releases in 1993. However, while these reviews show that at least a few people understood and liked what GBV was doing in the 80s, as we'll see when we talk about the later self-released records, neither of these mentions added up to any sort of breakthrough or success. Once again, there were no singles and no videos from the record. You can find a few of the original Halo LPs on Discogs. Otherwise, you can get it on LP or CD as part of the out-of-print 1995 box set from Scat. It's also available digitally on iTunes and Amazon and can be streamed on Spotify. So, to sum up, Sandbox is not at all a horrible record. The problem with GBV is they have so many good records, not to mention great ones, that there's no real reason to listen to Sandbox, and it's hardly a sellout or overproduced, as Paul had said. This record, along with Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, are the only GB records to not be featured on their best of, Human Amusements at Hourly Rates. I have to say that I agree with that. There's not one standout track. The closest to that for me is Every Day. It's a short record, so check it out. You'll be glad you did. Okay, that's it for 1987's Sandbox. Guided by Voices didn't release anything in 1988, but returned in 1989 with Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, so that's what I'll be discussing in the next episode. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.
On the sex